19 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and it's tape number 529, January the 25th, 1982. That month went away pretty fast, and there's a lot of news to cover. I'm going to do probably the second half of this program, or three-quarters of it, on the Air Florida flight that went down in the Potomac in Washington, D.C. on January the 14th. But before I do that, I want to run down some stories that are in the news that I may get back to later that are important, and to update a few of the back programs before I lose track of this information. I very seldom make a local announcement on this program, but we do have a John Maury, he's president of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers of the CIA. He'll be speaking here on the Peninsula Wednesday at 12:15 at the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies. If you want to go over and see him or meet a real live head of the intelligence community, one of the highest officials who's here speaking, this is happening here on the Monterey Peninsula this next Wednesday. Also on the 30th, George Bush is going to be here for the large Republican convention. I'm trying to get out some handbills or printed sheets, if I can, on his relationship as director of the CIA to the Orlando Letelier murder, Ronnie Moffett in Washington, D.C., his links to Theodore Shackley, George Corcola, Edward Wilson, Frank Turple, the main assassination teams of the CIA, George Bush's role with those people linked to Nazis, Gestapo, Nazis living in Chile, Argentina, Florida, and around the world. George Bush is a very important person as the director of the CIA, with context when they were really pushing and training the terrorist teams overseas in Uganda, Libya, and South America. So he will be here, and hopefully maybe we can hand out some pamphlets. Last week I went pretty quickly on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's birthday. I ran out of time. Maybe in a few weeks, if the news slows down, I'll do an update on the new evidence that has come out since the House Select Committee and stories about Martin Luther King as a victim of the American assassination syndrome. Briefly on 60 Minutes tonight, they read a letter asking for an investigation into the Malcolm X murder, and that the two men that are in prison serving time might not have done it at all. And somebody wrote a letter asking, why hasn't this been opened up? The House Select Committee on Assassinations should have gone into John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King at the same time, because the same people were behind them, and they just chose two assassinations, and at the end concluded both of those were conspiracies. There is this new book out by David Garrow, The FBI and Martin Luther King, From Solo to Memphis. It's the expose of the murder of Martin Luther King and the letters he would get from the FBI, from the highest levels of the FBI, telling him his end was approaching, that he should commit suicide, look into his heart, and know that he's a fraud and a liability to Negroes, and take his filthy, fraudulent self and do something to it to help the nation. Those were letters from the FBI that were being sent to him before he was murdered, and they are in that book, The FBI and Martin Luther King, by David Garrow, that just was published recently, Norton Press. A question came up in a trial in San Francisco and Oakland last week, where a person who had pleaded guilty to a crime on 60 Minutes was being tried, and they tried to get a change of venue because of publicity on the program. The judge threw that out. He said the jurors are not informed. No more than 15% take a daily newspaper, 5% take a news periodical, and 30% watch TV, and those that do only watch the sports. He said, I don't mean to be hard, but they're not informed. And he said when they took a prospective group of jurors, there were 50 of them for a recent death penalty phase, they were questioned, and not one of them knew who Adolf Hitler was. This was in a court in Oakland recently. This week, this coming week, will be the anniversary of the 100th year since Franklin Roosevelt was born. The administration of Ronald Reagan is tearing apart all the goals or ideals that he had and put together after what we refer to as the Great Depression. A young student from Harvard is going to have speeches in Congress, and then they're going to have tape recordings of the voice of Franklin Roosevelt. The fellow, his name is Peter Covier. He studied Roosevelt's speeches and history, at Harvard University, and he's heir to the Jim Beam fortune, the distillery, and he is putting this program on to remind people of the contrast, I suppose, between Herbert Hoover's administration, but the speeches of Roosevelt that gave so much hope to people at a time when they were really rock bottom. And simultaneously with the celebration of the birthday of Franklin Roosevelt, his mansion was almost burned down. Most of the papers, or some of them, were protected, but the third floor was extensively damaged. And last night there was a fire at the FDR mansion. Conspiracy or coincidence? I would believe that simultaneously with the celebration of Roosevelt's birthday, somebody had a hand in setting fire. For researchers who take this tape or listen to the broadcast that we do on this program, look in your books and biographies information on Honeywell Corporation and Dector. Dector is a company that makes government contracts for lie detector tests, electronic equipment. A friend is putting a story together. I can't give you the details, but we're looking for the German Nazi connections to the Honeywell Dector Corporation. So get busy with your bibliographies, articles, and so forth. And when I put a call out for this, you'd be surprised how many researchers can get there and copy articles, and it rings a bell and they supply the information. So I'll put you to it. That's your homework for this week. Anything on Dector Corporation or Honeywell. Last week I briefly mentioned, and I will get into it in detail later, the trial of Klaus von Bulow that's taking place right now in Newport, Rhode Island. But I must say that even though he's been charged with injecting his wife, she's in a coma, will not recover from it. He's been charged with this. I can tell you right now that he'll be acquitted of that. There's no use even having a trial. This week I read about the jury that was picked for Klaus von Bulow. There were 7 men and 5 women, but on this jury of 12 people, 4 are employers or employees of just one place. I've never heard of a trial like this, and the names, of course, in this case are dynamite and very important names. 4 came from one place. The one place is the United States Government Navy Intelligence. The 4 jurors are past or present employees of the Naval Underwater Systems Center. They make sea weapons for Navy intelligence. One's a computer analyst. The other is a Navy commander who works for U.S. Naval College. So with a Navy commander and a current computer expert and 2 employees of the Navy intelligence, you can believe that this jury will throw out the case. Klaus von Bulow is home free. It is a man with ties to Nazi Germany, with organizations throughout the entire world, the Bahamas, and every major country, who worked with John Paul Getty, who works with well-known prominent people in New York City, a patron of the arts, enormous fortune that he'll come into. But the selection of 4 people on the jury, such as this lineup, with no problem for the prosecution in accepting this kind of a jury, means that they're ready to blow the case. This happened with Dan White when they had a juror from Bechtel, a juror from the post office, one from the Army Presidio. When you get it with government, federal employees, or people with security clearances, they're not going to blame Dan White for shooting a gay supervisor or Mayor George Moscone. So forget the Klaus von Bulow trial. You can watch it unfold, but it's already in the can. He's home free. In the excitement of all the floods and the air crashes, there was an interesting article I picked up in the San Francisco Chronicle, only in one of my many papers. First, the lead story, I looked on page 46, psychologists tell how rats react to economic troubles. And I thought that was pretty funny. But right in the center, that was Raymond Broshears, and it was an obituary right in the center of the psychology story on the rats. Reverend Raymond Broshears funeral services will be held Monday. He died January the 14th, same time as that crash in Washington. Broshears is the controversial gay activist who died in San Francisco in his apartment at the age of 46. The San Francisco coroner's office released a preliminary autopsy that he died of a stroke. That's a preliminary, but he's been cremated. This article said his ashes will be interred in the San Francisco National Cemetery. If you want to go visit the ashes, That is the end of Reverend Raymond Broshears. Going back to the news of 1977, May 20th, 1977, Raymond Broshears testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Reading that news story, 2 investigators with the House Assassinations Committee extensively questioned a San Francisco minister this week who says he can link Lee Harvey Oswald to right-wing organizations in the New Orleans area. The Reverend Raymond Broshears said that he gave the House investigators a taped 2-hour question and answer session on his knowledge of the 1963 assassination of President Kennedy. Broshears said he was asked in detail about David Ferrie, and because he was close to David Ferrie, Broshears was, and Ferrie's relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans before the Kennedy murder. Ferrie was a former CIA contract agent who also worked with Carlos Marcello of organized crime, who died mysteriously in 1967, 5 days after he was publicly linked to the Kennedy conspiracy by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Broshears said he talked by telephone to David Ferrie 8 days before Ferrie's death, and he was convinced that Ferrie was murdered because of what he knew on the death plot. But the important thing was that David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald had ties to the Central Intelligence Agency and to trained right-wing groups and members of organized crime. And, of course, Carlos Marcello and Ferrie worked together, and Ferrie and Oswald in New Orleans were known to be together, according to Reverend Broshears. Several days after he gave information to the House Select Committee, that was May the 20th, this news story came over. By May 26th, he had his life threatened. Reverend Broshears claimed that he was getting telephone threats against his life. He received calls that he was giving information to the House Select Committee. They were threatening him, and the calls, he said, sounded deadly serious. Broshears said that the voice on the other end of the line said, "We know all about you." The voice went on to recount personal details about his past. Broshears later went to the Bay Area in San Francisco and was a gay activist, and David Ferrie also was not a gay activist. He was a far right-wing, but a gay person in the New Orleans area. He got telephone calls that said, "You're going to regret talking to the investigators," and then they would hang up. And he said again, he had information that Lee Harvey Oswald was in the company of the right-wing anti-Castro people, and he had information. And then he went on to say that the threats at night were telling him that his name is on a mafia hit list. Now, Broshears felt that people from going back several years ago were going to murder him. They were threatening to murder him. That was back in 77, but 1982, he got it, and that's the end of Reverend Raymond Broshears. The important thing is that the CIA people that he knew were working with David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald with the same team of Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, George Corcola, the Frank Turple outfit. Edwin Wilson was paymaster for the Bay of Pigs. So was George Corcola, working with Mitchell Werbel and those silencers. Broshears was killed, I'm positive. He was murdered like David Ferrie just at this time when Frank Turple is dangling on national television and around the world those silencers and guns and hinting at assassinations, which go back to the Kennedy assassination, and then it's time to clean out Broshears. Now, along with his murder came another one this week. That's Joey. His nickname is Joey. He's a high killer for the mafia, Max Kurschner. Now, he could have been one. He was in the San Francisco Bay Area and Bay Meadows this last week when he was gunned down by a single bullet. And Kurschner had bragged about killing 53 people for organized crime. He wrote a book, Joey Kills. I have the book, and I'll do more details on Kurschner later because his brother was a high-up former New York City cop called Max Kurschner, while the brother was doing the hits for the mafia and for the CIA. And he wrote a book published by Playboy, and just this week he was gunned down in California just a few days after Raymond Broshears died. The important thing about Kurschner is that he was not only a collector for the Vito Genovese family, but he was a member of the Vito Genovese family. Kurschner, the hired mob killer, whose brother was one of the officials of the New York Police Department, was related to Vito Genovese. Genovese had a niece, and these two boys, the hitman Max and Morris Kay, the New York City cop, were sons of Vito Genovese's niece. And so you know how close that these mafia families could interrelate or work together. And again, the important part of Genovese, going back to the Kennedy assassination and Reverend Broshears or Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry, was that Jack Ruby got involved in a payment with Vito Genovese and was working with them. They were involved in the Kennedy assassination with Carlos Marcello, so that there is a link that I won't detail now, but a member of the Genovese family was gunned down. He did 53, or bragged about that many people he had killed, and he was out floating around with no problems, working for the mafia and CIA. I have, as I say, I have his book, and there's an interesting chapter in the book that I'm going to do more details on later. I keep saying later, but there's so much news out, and I don't want you to miss the stories of the murder of Kurschner in your local papers. The book Killer, the autobiography of a hitman for the mafia, had chapter 10 is Some of Our Best Friends Are in Show Business. Now, there's a scandal going on in Hollywood that I will spend a lot of time on soon. The William Holden, Natalie Wood, William French Smith, Elizabeth Taylor combine linked with Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan. And in this chapter of his book that he wrote a while back, it goes into Frank Sinatra and organized crime. Well, when Frank Sinatra is right behind the President of the United States most of the time, right by his side and whenever he needs him, it also is important that people like Max Kurschner be removed if they're linked to the Genovese family, because Sinatra was close with Carlos Gambino and John Rosselli. At the time, Gambino and Rosselli were involved in the Kennedy assassination. And this, I have an idea that this Kurschner was one of the major enforcers, and with Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, it's a very interesting time to wipe out this Kurschner. It's also an important time to get rid of Raymond Broshears, who could link Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, to the international fascist organizations that are being just peeked at with scenes like Frank Churchill has, but could blow wide open if he wanted some immunity or break these scandals. There's another picture in the paper this week. I don't know why it was there. It's an Associated Press picture called Wanted Men, and there's two men smiling in this, and again, I'll do more details later. One is Britain's Ronald Briggs in Brazil, and the other is France's Albert Spaghieri, who is wearing a wig and a mustache, and they're both safe in Brazil. One took $10 million from a famous robber, and the other took $3 million out of Nice. The important thing about Spaghieri, and I don't know why his picture is here at the time, as I say, is he's written up in detail in that book, The Great Heroin Coup, and his links to Madrid, to the international fascist organization, to the P2 scandal in Italy, the Masonic scandal, and to the Marseille narcotics Nazi connection is very heavily related to the formation of Solidarity in Poland with Lech Walesa, that I have a lot of outlines that I will be sharing with you. And it's interesting that there was no article about Spaghieri at this time. I'll share more information on him and the links to Walesa and to AFL-CIO and to the murder of Allende, the fascist organizations with their headquarters in Madrid. He took the money from the Nice, the famous robbery, came to the United States. George Bush was director of the CIA at the time, then went to France and put the money in Madrid. So at a time where all of these people are running around the globe, semi-exposed, there was a picture of them with no story, just wanted men, and they may be the next ones to be wiped out. Don't forget that whoever killed Max Kurschner is out there doing the job for that team and taking over where Kurschner left off and Broshears is dead. The anniversary of the hostages last week, I did a little bit in the week before on McKell Jr., John D. McKell Jr., and his arrest in Texas belonging to the Gestapo Police Department. The Chicago Sun-Times had an update, where are the hostages now? And they describe Mr. McKell as a Marine Guard assigned to training management element at Aircraft Wing Training School, El Toro, California. And the New York Times has a long story. What are they doing now? John D. McKill Jr., a Marine guard in Iran, is now doing Marine training. So with all their good investigators and reporters, there's no mention of his links in Texas to this particular police department and the violence that he's been charged with. I have done a program, Not Enough. I want to get back to Otto von Bolschwing, that notorious Nazi that worked for Heinrich Himmler, the OSS simultaneously, and for Adolf Hitler and Allen Dulles at the same time, and then came to this country. But I did mention November 22nd, that was a while back on broadcast 520, about Otto von Bolschwing, and also his links to the woman in the White House who now makes all appointments for Ronald Reagan. Her name is Helene vonDamm. She was secretary to Ronald Reagan when he was in California. Now she's secretary to him in Washington, D.C. She was a German translator for Otto von Bolschwing, who was brought to California when Reagan became the governor. She worked for the corporation von Bolschwing was the head of, and later was linked to Frank Terpel. This particular woman, whose name was in the paper this week, with the expose on von Bolschwing being concealed. He's simply been told he can stay in this country and not deported. Jack Anderson wrote about Helene vonDamm, White House pipeline. He said, this is Friday, January the 15th, a new White House Personnel Committee will be headed by Helene vonDamm, which is giving her more power than ever. She will survey, scrutinize, and double-check all the administration's political appointees to see if they meet the proper conservative standards. I guess that's if they're wearing swastikas on their undershirts. The loyalty review is in response to complaints by the hardline Reagan supporters that too many moderates are getting jobs in the administration. So Reagan's just too liberal for this Gestapo secretary. She has to decide, and I call her Gestapo secretary because of her links to Otto von Bolschwing and the Galen operation and her career that began in Sacramento, sitting on the side and screening people for Reagan at the time and then moving to Washington and having the identical position. Anyone so close to a Nazi war criminal who should be deported shouldn't be in the position of White House of making appointments now. But according to Jack Anderson, she has been promoted. This January 18th, this past week, was an anniversary. In 1943, Moscow ended the 16-month siege of Leningrad, and that literally was the decision that Germany could not win World War II. It was shortly after that time, and I've mentioned it many times, that the Nazis went underground by April and May of 1943 after the defeat, January the 18th, 1943, and retrenched for people like Helene vonDamm and the Gestapo getting into place. This is the anniversary this January of their holding the line in Leningrad, but now they have to watch the resurgence of the Nazi movement around the world, getting ready to make war again. I had an article a while back I forgot to share with you that somebody mailed to me. I asked, where is Maxine Cheshire? She left the Washington Post. She's the most magnificent reporter there is. She had such wonderful things, and she does have a paperback book that you can get a lot of information from. It was published by Dell in 1978. In August of this last year, 1981, in the New York Post, they had an article, Maxine Exit. Another one bites the dust. I don't know who the other people were that preceded her in the news media. Maxine Cheshire, the ace syndicated columnist from the Washington Post, is getting married. She's leaving, but explained editor-in-chief Benjamin Bradley, who was with the CIA, Maxine would be married in Houston, Texas. She's getting married to Jack Warren. I assume she's married there now, co-owner of the Astros, and will not be on the staff of the Washington Post anymore. The article goes on to say that she was miffed because Bradley hired a competitor from the Washington Star when that folded up, and they wanted her to share her column with a column called The Ear. In no way would she share the column. It's a shame she left. One day a week would be better than what we're getting now from the Washington Post. She just had the most wonderful stories and was breaking a lot on the Nugan Hand Bank, on the links of Vesco to the narcotics traffic, to the Carter administration. And she also was revealing a lot of interconnecting links of Washington, D.C. characters that we couldn't get from any other person. In her book, she has one interesting section about Admiral Rembrandt Robinson, who was supposed to become Chief of Naval Operations. He is Kissinger's liaison with Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Moore, and he hoped Robinson wanted to be promoted to Chief of Naval Operations. But there was a party in Washington, D.C., given by Princess Grace of Monaco's nephew, or younger cousin. His name is John Layman, who graduated at Cambridge in England. It was a black tie, sans pantalons. The men came without their pants, and the women were dressed. And Maxine Cheshire described this and the trouble she had with Ben Bradley trying to force her at that time to retract what she was saying and try to get signatures that the article wasn't true. She had printed this story of this particular party. Later, instead of becoming Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Robinson was shot down and killed in Vietnam over the Tonkin Gulf, and that ended that scandal. Her book is filled with the inner workings of Washington, D.C., things that you don't see very many places. There was a television movie I want to briefly just tell, you probably saw, I'll just tell you a few anecdotes about it. It was last week. It was called Marion Rose White, and it was based on her experiences in a California hospital where she was sterilized by a Dr. Ashcroft. And the description of the movie tells how, in this particular movie, she was not mentally retarded. Her mother put her in a home for mentally retarded. She couldn't learn or study because she needed glasses, and they put her there and had her sterilized. But at the time that Dr. Ashcroft was sterilizing her in California Hospital in the 30s, he was corresponding in Great Britain with doctors in Great Britain and also in Germany with Himmler, who was interested in how California was doing sterilizations. And the TV review in the San Francisco Chronicle said, "Isn't it frightening that we were ahead of Hitler, that the sterilization was here, and King George consulted this Dr. Ashcroft?" Well, if you study the medical situation in California and in the United States, there's a lot more to it than we have ever been told, and it's worth investigating. And once again, Errol Flynn's story, Charles Hyam wrote in Errol Flynn, The Untold Story, he tells about Dr. Hermann Friedrich Urban, who joined the Nazi Party in 1922, became a United States citizen in 1930 in San Francisco, worked for the Rockefeller Institute, then was with the Gestapo going around the world with the Nazis recruiting, and a close friend recruited Errol Flynn into the organization. The other item that I've had on programs before about Dr. Joseph Mengeles from Auschwitz, who's now working and still working in South America and Paraguay on the Indians there and sterilizing them, and worked for NASA on radiation experiments. He was naturalized in New York, December the 5th, 1932, and incidentally, that FBI report described him as having, in the United States, coming in with dyed hair, plastic surgery, and he masqueraded himself as a construction worker. And I want to get back to construction workers also, as well as doctors, in the second half of this program. Well, this story of Marion Rose White in the 1930s makes sense if you think that Dr. Ashcroft was in correspondence with Himmler, or Dr. Mengeles was in New York as an American citizen, or Dr. Urban was naturalized in San Francisco. The experiments on how to eliminate people or genocide evidently has been going on for many, many years, and it's just by bits and pieces of programs such as this that you can make comparisons or begin to add up something that we never were told or people don't want to believe, but seems to be a little more common, and goodness knows how far it goes. 60 Minutes this evening had a section on an Army doctor who does heart surgeries, who then went on to Milwaukee, whose heart surgeries, about 43% were fatal. The Army covered it up. They forged signatures of approval for him. He was out of the Army with the highest honors. His name was Dr. Stanford, not qualified to do heart surgery. The women were dying or permanently maimed. Children died. They particularly mentioned women and children. He wasn't qualified to do the surgery. Why did the Army give him the approval? Why did the highest people in the hospitals approve of what he was doing, forge other doctors' names when they wouldn't sign it, gave him accolades and honors when he left the Army, let him go to another city to do surgery when they knew he wasn't qualified? What is going on at an Army hospital? Are these experiments, and that he was protected by experiments? Is he like Dr. Ashcroft or Dr. Urban or Dr. Joseph Mengele's? How much is going on to maim people in this country for drug companies or for neutralizing people or people that are maybe political that are on Army bases? 60 Minutes just brought that up, and I think of these other doctors, and it's worth asking the question. We'll take a 1-minute break now and get back to Air Florida, Flight 90. 1 more minute.
This concludes the first half. FM 102 KLRB, and now here's Mae with part 2.
I'm going to discuss the Air Florida Flight 90 that went down January the 14th, 1982. I probably won't be able to do it all in 1/2 hour, but maybe I'll just present some of the most interesting questions and throw them around with you and go into some of the details and continue a part 2 next week. I'm asked the question often, was there a reason for this particular plane or this particular accident to happen? Couldn't it just be a general malfunction? Does it always have to be a conspiracy? Can it be a natural thing like snow or frost? Is there a reason to believe that this is a conspiracy? I'm also asked, does every disaster have to be caused? Do you look too much for the details when it's just a natural event, a mechanical thing that goes wrong like an engine, or a natural thing, as I say, like the snow, or are there such things as natural deaths, or is every death planned? And my answer to these questions is that if you listen to my programs for the past 11 years, you'll know that I don't discuss every death and every disaster, every tornado, or every epidemic on the air. But when I discuss something, I have reason to believe that these events, the ones that I discussed, are caused by outside persons. There are storms and epidemics and many physical and mental problems that I don't even have time to discuss, but I have a massive amount of books and articles indicating that sabotage is real, bombings are planned, murders are planned, train derailments are planned, plane crashes are planned, and many are done on purpose. Some people die of natural causes, but some people have deaths that are caused by others. Some accidents take place because of faulty equipment, but in those cases, the circumstances are explainable or consistent, while other events and crashes demand further explanation. And our Army booklets, I have copies of some of them from Fort Ord and some that have been sent to me from the Army, and books put out by Palladium Press in Colorado, how to blow up a plane, how to sabotage a train, how to break down bridges, how to cause political assassinations, how to use silencers. There's a whole world of literature taught to our veterans of Vietnam, our private mercenaries, to corporations who use this material. Therefore, it's imperative every time there is a major accident to go into what is happening. Now, so far I've broken down the Air Flight 90, the Air Florida flight that went into the Potomac, into a very interesting passenger list. The most interesting passenger on this plane for me is Jose Tirado, the man who drowned in the incident with his baby, and his wife is alive at this time. There's always the mystery witnesses who appear and call in with information. Who was the priest at the crash site? We'll go into that. Who was filming the scene, like the San Diego airplane crash that was, I believe, a political crash a few years ago. Our Lieutenant Governor Donnelly was supposed to be on it, at the last minute changed his flight. Who was Nancy Reagan meeting in the intensive care immediately? What is the motive behind the crash? Is there a legitimate motive? And why was this rehearsed 5.5 months ago, last July, right to the day, 5.5 miles away, for a simulated 50 people dying? This crash was rehearsed right to the button. How does the news media cover it up? Why the delay in rescue teams? And how does the TV camera always get there before the rescue teams? It's like Jonestown. They brought in Time and Newsweek and the cameraman who photographed these people face down before they bring in persons who could remove the bodies and identify them before they're all melted into 240 common graves for babies, and they're not identifiable unless you want to lose their identity. And what are the secrets of the black box recorder? and how far will they tell us about what is going on? People on the plane were a who's who. The most important, there were 7 military men, 3 from the Rapid Deployment Force and 2 from the Readiness Command. The plane was held over. It was a delay for 2 who were to arrive late, and one of the late departures that arrived on time did survive. There were 7 people from Fairchild Industries who died. Fairchild Industries in Southeast Asia was a cover for Nugan Bank, for one of the people there from Australia. Wilson, Turple, and Coca-Cola have interlocking links with these aerospace industries. There was chairman of the firms of public utility from Price Waterhouse, Gordon Calvin from George Steinbrenner's American Shipbuilding Company. Of course, we'll never know these people or their links to any motive there would be to get any single one of them. They're not as prominent as Dorothy Hunt when her plane crash went down in Chicago a few years ago. There was a survivor of Auschwitz. Of course, as I say, the most important one for me was Jose Tirado. He was a cement mason worker in Washington, D.C., who worked for Vice President George Bush. He'd only been in the United States 1 month when he was working for George Bush. And the saga of that family with Nancy Reagan going to intensive care to meet his wife, to me, as I say, is the most interesting story. I called Sherman Skolnick in Chicago. He's the expert on the Dorothy Hunt plane crash, and he believed that the motive in this particular flight was a war between the airlines in trying to knock out Air Florida. Now, if Sherman is correct about this, then it was sabotage for a particular motive to get the airline and not the people on the line, but then you can pack it with people that you know are going to take that flight. Maybe it can be arranged that way, but Sherman believed that. There were stories to this effect. One, a UPI story from the San Francisco Examiner, doomed jet flew on a hot line. It was a hot route because it was a low discount. They never had a vacant seat. They were described as one of the brash new air carriers competing for a great share of the market. They had a flawless record up to this crash. They were formed in 1972, and they fly to Europe, Caribbean, Central America, Washington, New York, Boston, Honduras, and many cities in Florida. Another article that gets a little more scary, Air Florida's recent financial troubles, 10 years of fast growth. This has to do with their undercutting big companies like Pan American, World Airways, and TWA. Well, you're in trouble there when you begin to undercut. They had a system in this price where they didn't escalate their prices. They had one price, first come, first serve. Now, the man who headed up this company that made it very successful, Edward Acker, left there in September of this year. He was working for Air Florida and went on to Pan American, that is very much in debt and needs business very badly in the very areas that this place, Air Florida, is flying. So Pan America needs their business, and if anybody has been a cover for the Central Intelligence Agency, and part of the CIA would have the technology for this kind of a disaster, would be Pan America. There's a lot of Pan America CIA connections in the book Air America by Christopher Robbins, put out by G.P. Putnam in 1979. The links of Pan Am to the CIA, to Air America, to Bay of Pigs, to Laos. And that's the same team exactly responsible for the combination of assassinations, dope money, and the Nazi connections to Madrid, to Italy, to Argentina, to Chile, to Germany, to Miami that I've been talking about week after week on this program. Pan Am was the parent company of Air America, and there are strong links to that. So the man who was the head of very successful Air Florida left there in September. So 4 months later, there is this crash in the Potomac that had been rehearsed, and the head of this airline is working for a company that has been very bankrupt recently, and that would be not only a very good motive, but a means of doing what they had to do if they wanted to knock out, if the major companies wanted to knock out a small company. Washington Post has an article, Air Florida, the small skyrocket airline, already had bumpy weather. Well, they didn't already have bumpy weather. The article says after a few months, Air Florida had the cut rate, until a few months ago, they had the cut rate flight to the future. That was before the air control strike. They have a large control of $21 million a year operation. They wanted to take over Western Airlines. Pan Am, this article says in the Washington Post, was in trouble, and the chairman of the board, Edward Acker, who got the success for Air Florida, went to Pan Am in September, and they were competing with flights. London, Costa Rica, Venezuela, you name it, competing with the major airlines that are going broke. This is their first problem, their first crash, and they were competing with the major companies, and one of those that is broke, and strong links to the Central Intelligence Agency, the president of Air Florida went to them in September. Washington Post, January the 15th, 1982, mock plane crash showed quick response but other problems. 6 months ago in July, there was a problematic crash 5.5 miles from where this took place. It was outside of Washington, D.C., put up by Federal Aviation and Washington, D.C., the airport, and they simulated a plane going in the Potomac River between National Airport and this time the Woodrow Wilson Bridge instead of the other bridge. They simulated that 6 months ago. They made a mock rescue of 55 passengers. This time it was a little bit more than 55, but pretty close. And they simulated where the police would go in the boat. So they should have been pretty well prepared for the disaster. And then, of course, the next question comes, why the delay if they had the mock program? Now, there was a cab driver, a secret witness, described in the San Francisco Examiner, January the 18th. Cab driver witness sought in probe of Air Florida crash. A search is on for a mystery witness who may have seen the takeoff of Air Florida 90. He's the man who has the crucial information explaining what happened. Now, this cab driver is also a private air pilot. He called up, he gave them information on the altitude, the feed, the details. He won't tell what cab company he drives for. He said that the aircraft had the landing gear down, and he has detailed information. He called and gave this information. He telephoned the Accident Command Center several hours after the crash, described himself as a private pilot, but in terms of investigation, at least as of this date, he's not coming forward, but he was there, and his name is not known. The cab company, they're only speculating. They believe he worked for the Diamond Cab Company. Why he wouldn't come forward, I don't know, but he gave some facts to the command center, and they need him badly, but he's not going to come forward. Why not? What does he know, and how much, if it was a conspiracy, would he gain from the information of being on site? Then there's the mysterious priest. The crash site priest is held as a fugitive. Now, a man was going around immediately after the accident at the Marriott Hotel, speaking to people. He was the priest allegedly comforting people. He posed as a priest. He comforted relatives. He was on the scene. Later, he was at the Marriott Hotel assisting people and talking to them. He had federal connections. He, in quotes, escaped from a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut. That's where G. Gordon Liddy was housed. His name was William Emlinger. He's wanted in New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey, but they don't say why he's wanted. He was recognized on television when he was comforting these people as being somebody they wanted both in Danbury, Connecticut, and in New Jersey. Now, the interesting thing is that he was comforting them at the scene of the disaster and at the Marriott Hotel with people, but Danbury didn't have a notice that he was missing until December the 16th. He was listed missing out of a federal penitentiary December the 16th. This is from the Washington Post, January the 17th. He didn't return from a furlough, but he has a description of having been at other scenes of disasters, that he has a history of showing up at disaster scenes. Now, wouldn't you just love to know what disaster scenes he attends? He has a priest's cloak and the collar and so forth, just happened to be recognized, but wouldn't you want a little bit of research on who he was? In the book Spooks by Jim Hogan, who did the script on the Frank Turple movie, helped write it, he describes a Spanish-born priest who was also a Japanese citizen who went by the name of Jose Guardiano. He changed his name to Jose Aramilla, And he was a courier for what the Japanese police described as underground bank base. It had to do with Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Spain. He carried money and bribes, payoffs, and the sums, according to Jim Hogan, were hand-carried aboard airplanes in flight bags that were held a certain amount of money. He was disguised as a priest. He worked for the Japanese organized crime, was involved with the Lockheed scandals that also Henry Kissinger and Prime Minister Tanaka and Richard Allen were involved in. So the use of priests at airport tragedies or at airports, or collecting the bag money, or meeting with these people. He may have been released from a federal job, or the cover was he's wanted in a federal penitentiary. This gang of Richard Allen, the Japanese mafia, the mafia from Hong Kong, the Nugan Han gang, they use priests. They use the clergy, the collar of the clergy. So looking back at history to the past use of priests that worked with people that I've mentioned before on these programs, they had this mysterious priest wanted in Trenton, New Jersey, and also not even noticed to be missing from Danbury, Connecticut, when he's at the Marriott Hotel with these people. And maybe some of these wonderful people from the flight list were carrying some of that mysterious bag money that the families, maybe he was to hush them or pay them up. The people went down in the plane, but he was meeting the families, and there may have been some very important families whose role as cover of the CIA or active agents of the intelligence community. So as he comforts them, he knows who they are. Another fact that I mentioned, just ran over, was the fact that the flight was being filmed like that PSA in California. The San Jose Mercury had an article on the 16th. Crash team finds the body, but not the answers. Then the investigators found new evidence that would reveal maybe the cause of the crash, a film taken at the airport. Well, don't you know how many photographers are standing watching a collision of planes in San Diego or in a snowstorm, how comfortable it is to take this particular plane and film it. Somebody was on the scene of Air Florida by the runway filming. The film was taken by a television station as part of a routine weather story. You know how many of those are. And federal investigator Rudolph Kapustin said it was highly unlikely the plane could be any other than the one that crashed. He was filming this plane at the time, and they're looking for this particular person. He did get a shot of that plane. There were other reports that the crash team was angered by press accounts. The head of the team investigating the fatal crash clamped a lid of secrecy. They want no rumors, no misinterpretations. They cautioned the news media, don't speculate on the facts. The National Transportation Safety Board, Francis McAdams, warned that he's annoyed by reports, one in Orlando, Florida, in the Sentinel-Star, about the crash and about the sinking of the ship, and that the last thing heard on the voice box was, "Get the noise down, we're going to go in." They put a lid on the recordings. They do not want that information out. Another lid was put on a story reported in the San Francisco Examiner of Arlen Williams, the fellow from Atlanta, Georgia, who allegedly gave his life to rescue other people. Dr. Brian Blackburn gave an account of this, but he was describing Mr. Williams' attempt to save other people before he drowned. The Washington, D.C. Park Police told the paramedic, Gene Windsor, do not cooperate with the news. The Park Police said, we will make every effort to positively identify the man. Before they did it, they were instructed by a paramedic, Gene Windsor, and the helicopter pilot, do not cooperate directly with the news media. Even on a human interest story of a man trying to save people, do not cooperate. Don't attempt to identify him by viewing file photographs shown by the news organizations. They were warned, don't cooperate. Now, the person that I found the most interesting, I say, is the fellow that Nancy Reagan went to visit in the hospital, his wife. He's dead, Priscilla Tirado. Within a very short time, the great Lady Bountiful was doing her little duty. She wasn't meeting the people at the airport or the families that had lost somebody. The Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia family, she ran right over to intensive care where she met a woman, Priscilla, whose husband and baby died. Her husband worked in Madrid, and he came to this country. He was a Spaniard, Jose, 23 years old, and he emigrated this country for the purpose of Priscilla having that baby in the United States. They lived in College Park, Maryland, and Jose, as soon as he got to this country, got a job with George Bush at his mansion. He, according to the newspaper, was a cement mason in Washington, D.C. Now, it's interesting that he comes from Madrid and goes directly to the home of Vice President George Bush, because this, I think, would be highly unlikely at this particular time. March 30th, in 1981, there was a murder attempt on Ronald Reagan in Washington, D.C., and there were strong links of John Hinckley Sr., John Hinckley Jr.'s father, and the CIA to people involved in the murder attempt on Ronald Reagan. And if you don't have those tapes, you can order those. I won't backtrack the evidence of the Bush family, the CIA, and Edward Bennett Williams of the CIA to the murder attempt of Ronald Reagan. May the 13th, 1981, there was an attempt to shoot John Paul II, the Pope, by Mohammed Ajah, who was in Spain, who had links to the International Fascist Organization. And Ajah and the attempt on Ronald Reagan have been linked by various people and researchers, and Frank Churchill has claimed credit of the CIA and worked with the group that trained Ajah in Hitler's, the organization, the Grey Wolves. Hitler started as the Werewolf Organization. Spain is the headquarters of the International Fascist Organization set up by Otto Skorzeny from Adolf Hitler's organization, as I say, going down to Chile and Argentina. And Madrid was the area where E. Howard Hunt's wife had a large position in the CIA. She was even over him in that role in Madrid. So this guy comes from Madrid, and at a time when we're being warned that these assassins are coming over from Europe, Libya, trained by Gaddafi to shoot Ronald Reagan or George Bush or Alexander Haig. We're told there's the tightest security. Now, if you've seen pictures of the home that the vice president lives in, it's on the Navy base. Rockefeller moved there first, Nelson Rockefeller. It's all Navy property. It's isolated. It's private grounds. It isn't a private home on the street where he'd be doing this masonry work. So I think it's very interesting that he comes from Madrid, and his father said in the newspaper, within 1 month, he's working for Vice President George Bush at a time where we're looking for international would-be assassins or terrorists, where Spain is the place where Ajah went for several weeks before he went directly to Rome to shoot at the Pope. These people are over here from Spain. It's hard to get into a union of bricklayers or masonry in this country. A Spaniard from Madrid getting in the union, forget it. And going to the vice president's house, forget it. There's more to this particular family, and immediately after the accident, Nancy was over with in the intensive care unit with his widow greeting her. The union question of getting in and doing the cement work is weird. Working on a Navy grounds with a short time in this country is weird. Working for the former director of the CIA and having come from Madrid, all of this added together with Nancy run over there, has to be the most interesting passenger on the plane. In the San Francisco Chronicle last week, Friday, December 18th, there was an article, 3 drug suspects seized near George Bush's home. Now, I don't think for a minute that any of these people want George Bush. It's similar to the CIA working closely with the people that sat either side of Sadat when Sadat was murdered, and the CIA knew that he was going to be murdered, and Mubarak was at George Bush's home for lunch 2 days before Sadat was murdered. And keep in mind the links of George Bush to these assassination teams and Edwin Wilson and the hardcore assassination teams. Now, around his home in Florida, George Bush, a few miles from his house, George Bush's Secret Service or security picked up 3 people, one a man from Iran, one from Italy, a 20-year-old person from Italy, and one from Yugoslavia. As a fluke, the sheriffs just happened to pick them up. I didn't even know that George Bush had a home in Stuart, Florida. I know he has one in New Hampshire or Maine and one in Houston, Texas, where he came from, in Washington, D.C., but it's interesting. This story came over United Press, Stuart, Florida. 3 foreigners were tracked by the Drug Enforcement Agency. The officials said since they left Chicago, they were being followed. They had guns, ski masks, binoculars, and other items, and a rented car, and they are 3 miles from the home of George Bush. How perfect to have an Iranian, an Italian, Yugoslavian in this country and even around there, and then go back and maybe knock off Ronald Reagan because they didn't get to do it last March. The men had two 38 caliber revolvers, 45 caliber semi-automatic. In the trunk, the Secret Service had followed them from Chicago to Florida in a rental car. The whole story is interesting, though, the interlocking links of Bush, and I think it's important to go into how many of these stories are not followed through later. They just drop, and that is the end of the story. Now, the emergency service was interesting at this flight, and that's all I have time to go for now. At 4:04, Evelyn D. White of Arlington, Virginia, heard on a radio band about the airplane crash, and she called 911 and told them there was a crash on the 14th Street Bridge. I don't know who in the heck Evelyn White is, that she picked it up first. She called the communications center and Richard Singer, and they dialed the National Airport. And the National Airport says, we're not sure that the plane went down. The aircraft tower said that they just weren't visible on radar. 11 minutes passed before the air traffic controller called the Park Police. And by 4:20, the helicopters then began coming over to get them out of the river. There's a long article in the Washington Post again saying there are inexplicable delays in the response, occasional squabbles, too few helicopters to try and get survivors out. It was 1 minute after her call that ambulances began to come from Washington, D.C., and fire trucks to the scene. But at 4:07, the fire department from Washington began to move, but it was 20 minutes before the first ambulance came to the bridge. Now, they rehearsed this on the bridge on the Potomac in July, just before the crash, and almost the same amount of people going down. But it was 20 minutes before the first ambulance reached the bridge. And the icebreaker boat that should have gone through the Potomac, it took them 15 minutes to get there, but it took the people 45 minutes to put their suits on. Now, you remember the one fellow that jumped in, he heard a scream, Lenny Skutnik. He heard a woman screaming, yelling, "Would somebody please help me?" And she grabbed the ring, and she looked like she was going to pass out. And he jumped in to get her because she was yelling for help. And the firemen and the police were standing there. And it's similar to the Jonestown again. The cameras are there, the people are there. But he had to jump in because they were watching. And it'd be an interesting question to ask why 20 minutes before the first city ambulance reached the bridge, and it was 45 minutes before the icebreaker boat on the Potomac could get on their suit. Army officials notified by the Civil Defense Command Center by 4:05 began to send helicopters, but they had 7 people from the special troops from the Emergency Command Center and the Special Operations Group that were killed in this airplane. And then, of course, shortly afterwards, 35 minutes afterwards, there was a subway that crashed in Washington, D.C., and that was another problem. Now, this article, this long article from the Washington Post, asks about the delays. It begins by saying, emergency service reach quickly the jetliner crash. The news media, again, playing up the wonders of the speed. Then the whole gist of the full-page article, and front page in the middle, is how slow it was. Now, Evelyn White had to call. The airport didn't have any information. They're not sure the plane went down. They waited. It was 11 minutes before the air controller called the Park Police. The Park Police were the ones who said to the people, don't give out any information, don't talk to the news media, don't identify people. There was delay at that level. There is a lot of information that is still being held secret. And then, of course, the latest story about the black box that was found, recordings recovered from jetliner kept secret. That was the latest, January 22nd, 1928. Well, with that in mind, with the secret priest, the man who photographed the crash, the pilot, cab driver, the dual role, who called and said the wheels were down, the delay in getting people there, the telling the news media to lay off and don't print stories. I happen to believe that there was a reason to get Air Florida out of the running, maybe break their back financially or hinder them or make people afraid of these cheap flights that were filled. The seats are filled every flight. And Pan Am and TWA and the major companies don't want to compete with that kind of gimmick. They want to have you have much higher prices and fill their pockets and make up their debts. We'll do more on this maybe next week, but those are the highlights of Air Florida, and this is Mae Brussell and Carmel. It's pretty quick, but there's a lot of news this week.
Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
This is KLRB, Carmel, in the air everywhere.
But what are the chances it will stay in the air for the whole show? Well, our transmitter has literally thousands of components that must all function perfectly, otherwise we're off. Your radio has hundreds of components.